let's talk about the Rwanda plan. I'm sure you're expecting a question or two on it. We've had quite the headlines this morning, Mr. Gove. We've got Professor John Curtis predicting that the Tories are going to be wiped out of the next general election. They may be reduced to 130 seats. We've got talk in the Mail on Sunday, would you believe, of a Boris Johnson comeback and a dream ticket with Nigel Farage. We've got Robert Jenrick having said this morning that he thinks that the government's Rwanda plan is simply for show and not for real, that it won't do anything to block individual appeals. It's dark days for the Tory party and your government, isn't it, Mr. Gove? Nothing's going to plan.
Well, there's certainly a lot in the Sunday newspapers, and Martin, I think, was reviewing them with consummate skill earlier. But my role as a minister is not to provide further political commentary, it's to get on with the job. And the Rwanda legislation that you mention is very important. It's a robust bill which will ensure that we can deport people to Rwanda because it's a safe third country, and that will be inordinately helpful in making sure that we can safeguard our borders and deliver the migration policy that the country wants to see.
But it is problematic, isn't it, that, of course, there is legal disagreement on this. And while I appreciate that lawyers are paid to disagree and disagree heavily, on one hand, you've got the likes of Lord Sumption saying they're happy with the legislation. On the other, you've got the Star Chamber of government lawyers saying, and indeed the government's own lawyer, James Eadie, saying that they're only half convinced that the legislation is actually going to be robust enough. James Eadie, who's the most senior government legal counsel, says there's a 50% chance that the European Court in Strasbourg will still interfere and issue an interim injunction to stop any flights to Rwanda. So this kind of summarises the problem, doesn't it? There's always going to be lawyers that are able to argue against this plan. And if the legislation isn't full fat, if it is weak, as Robert Jenrick has said, I mean, he's resigned on the issue, then it isn't fit for purpose.
This legislation is absolutely robust. There are all sorts of milk metaphors out there. This is Jersey gold top legislation because it is very clear that the basis on which people resisted being sent to Rwanda in the past, the justifications that were used then, will no longer apply. And I think the legal consensus is, particularly from people who have themselves sat on the Supreme Court, like Jonathan Sumption, that this legislation will ensure that there will only be a vanishingly small number of cases for individuals being able to resist being deported.
OK, so if you think it's robust and that it's Jersey gold top, can you give us a guarantee then that the European Court in Strasbourg won't be able to issue an interim injunction to stop flights to Rwanda? If you think it's robust enough, you must be able to give us that guarantee here now, a gold top guarantee from you, Mr. Gove.
It is clear that ministers will reserve the right to decide if there are these injunctions from the European Court, how to respond. And we are making it very clear in domestic legislation that Parliament's priority is to ensure that deportations can proceed. And it's important to recognise that the only way in which a deportation could not proceed is if someone was in imminent risk of serious and irreversible harm as a result of this deportation. That is a very high bar. I think every lawyer would agree.
But at the same time, what this doesn't do is block those individual appeals. So that was Robert Jenrick's whole problem, wasn't it? He resigned last week because he said, what's the point in this if we still have this legal merry-go-round continuing ad infinitum? And unfortunately, I'm hearing that you're saying the legislation's robust, but you can't rule out these individual appeals either.
It may well be the case that any individual says that they should not be deported, but first of all, they have to produce evidence, and then it will be the decision for a minister, not for the courts, to decide whether or not that evidence is appropriate. And so it is very, very clear that this legislation will empower ministers to ensure that people can be deported. And it sends a very clear message to the courts, if passed, that Parliament wants to see some of the process that we've had and almost all of the objections that we've had swept away.
Back in 2015, you were the one who led the charge as Justice Secretary to scrap the Human Rights Act and replace it with the Bill of Rights. I mean, you've not ruled out leaving the ECHR. What's your position on all that now? Because arguably, had you scrapped the HRA and replaced it with a Bill of Rights, you might not be in this mess.
Well, it was the case at the time that I and my colleague Dominic Raab were seeking to update and modernise our human rights architecture and to make our human rights architecture more robust. It was, as a result of that, our intention to stay within the European Convention on Human Rights, but the Prime Minister has made clear that we will do whatever it takes in order to ensure that we can get people who need to be deported from our shores deported. This legislation does what it takes, and it keeps us within the boundaries of international law as well.
If it doesn't do what you want it to do, when you say that you'll do anything that it takes, what does that actually mean, Mr. Gove? What else would you do?
Well, I think this bill is enough. I think it's a very robust piece of legislation. Again, I think it's important to make sure that people understand what's in this bill. So I think close scrutiny and appropriate interrogation of the bill shows that, for example, there are significant sections of the Human Rights Act, significant aspects of the way in which the ECHR operates, which are disapplied in this legislation. And Parliament is clear. Parliament, if the bill is passed, Parliament is also clear that there are a number of conventions, some pretty, robust conventions on, for example, human trafficking and on the resettlement of individuals, which are completely put to one side as a result of this legislation. And I think it's important that people have a chance to read the black and white of the bill and to form their own judgment on that.
You know that people won't do that. They'll just get an impression of the bill and its efficacy if it actually works and they see flights take off to Rwanda. Let's talk about another piece of legislation that you've been involved in, the Leasehold Reform Bill, Mr. Gove. Oh, go on. You're going to say that flights are going to take off when?
No, I'm just going to say that I do hope that people read the legislation because it is important. But you're absolutely right. The most important thing is making sure that flights do take off, and I'm sure they will. OK, if people do read the Leasehold Reform Bill, your bill had promised to abolish the feudal leasehold system, but it doesn't actually abolish leaseholds. What happened to the bill? We make sure that leasehold effectively becomes a redundant form of property ownership in the way in which we've seen it in the past, and we empower people to take control of their own properties. So anyone who's in a leasehold flat will know that as the lease, the term that covers their ownership of the flat winds down, so the value of their home reduces. But we're altering that. So
you've had to add an amendment to the bill.
Can transform. The bill will be amended in order to ensure that we strengthen the freedoms that we're giving to people. But the essential part of the bill, everyone listening or watching who's a leaseholder should know, is that they can take full control of their flat. They can go for a 990-year lease. They can make sure that the negotiation is straightforward. They can get the full value of their property. And you can tell from some of the objections that are being made by the freeholders, i.e. by the property barons, that they will be losing out because individual leaseholders are going to be enfranchised and empowered. You can tell from their concern or opposition that this is actually a way of making sure that people who are leaseholders get full control of their flats.
Let's talk about housing, Mr. Gove, because we had that historically high legal migration figure, 745,000. We heard from Home Secretary James Cleverly in the week that he wants to reduce that by at least 300,000. That then leaves the potential for 450,000 people to come to Britain every year. That, as far as I can tell, is the population of Leeds. Therefore, we would have to be building at least 500,000 dwellings a year to keep up with migration, let alone to keep up with the population rate in this country in the first place. So the bottom line is here, you built 204,530 new dwellings in the year ending March 2022. You're nowhere near building enough houses.
Yes, we do need to build more homes, and yes, we do need to bring migration down. I think the measures that you referenced, that James introduced earlier this week, will bring figures down, and will bring figures down to levels that people would consider to be appropriate for our economy. But of course we do need to build more homes, and that's why later this week we should be publishing new planning rules which ensure that we can get more of the right homes in the right places.